Hi everyone, this is Amirhossein Arzani, Assistant Professor at NAU, and today I'm going to talk about data-driven blood flow modeling. So high-fidelity patient-specific quantification of blood flow parameters and hemodynamics are really important in transformative modeling of cardiovascular disease. But the problem here is that if we're collecting experimental data, either in vivo or in vitro, we're often dealing with low spatial temporal resolution and a lot of times with lots of noise in these data. And also if you have even a minimally dissipative, high-resolution CFD code that we're running with high spatial temporal resolution and with high performance computing, we're still going to be limited in uncertainties in parameters such as boundary conditions. So the hypothesis behind this work is that if we can discover a hidden low-dimensional representation of our data, then we can couple that with data-driven modeling techniques to improve the quality of the data and overcome these limitations. So how do we identify low dimensionality in blood flow data? So let's first take our spatial temporal blood flow data and stack them into a data matrix X. So data matrix X is where for every column, we're placing the temporal velocity data and the rows represent our spatial data. So this could be either velocity or wall shear stress or anything that we're interested in. So then the goal is to identify low dimensionality in this data structure. So this could be either defined as a low rank structure due to high correlation in our data, or it could be sparsity in our data, for example, zero values or empty data. So a popular technique to identify such low dimensionality is known as principal component analysis, which we're going to talk about next, and we're going to see throughout the methods in this talk. So, in PCA, which is also known in the fluid mechanics community as proper orthogonal decomposition or POD, provides an optimal basis to represent our data with minimum number of modes. And the way we find these POD or PCA modes is by first taking our data matrix X, subtracting the temporal mean from the data, and then performing singular value decomposition, SVD, on the data. And then we can only keep the R dominant SVD modes such that we can reconstruct our data. So for example, in the example you're seeing here, we have a 3D blood flow data inside a cerebral aneurysm, and we can see that despite the apparent complexity in the hemodynamics environment, with only a few dominant PCA modes, we can reconstruct our velocity data. So now we can view PCA with different ways. So from a statistical viewpoint, really all we're doing in PCA is that we're finding hidden directions in our data such that our data along those directions the variation in our data are maximized. So we're finding directions that maximize variance in our data. From a geometric viewpoint, what we're doing in PCA is that we're finding a subspace in our data such that the majority of the data could be explained within that geometric subspace of our data. And finally, from an optimization viewpoint, which is how we actually compute PCA, what we're doing is that we're solving rank minimization problem. So we have our data matrix X, and then we're finding another matrix A that can approximate our data matrix X, but the matrix A is restricted to be of rank R. So, and you can show that this minimization problem has a solution, which is the SVD of our data matrix by only keeping the R dominant singular values. And then finally, we can view principal component analysis from a neural network perspective. So PCA could be shown that it's kind of similar, it's actually identical to a linear autoencoder. And this was actually known long before the rebirth of interest in AI and neural networks. And this is actually very promising because it enables us to extend PCA to nonlinear versions. Okay, now the goal of our study is that we would like to leverage this low dimensionality in our data and use that to improve the quality of the data. And by quality here, by improving quality, I mean that we want to overcome sparse and noisy experimental measurements. And we also want to overcome uncertainty in our high-resolution CFD simulations. So I'm going to talk about 3 different classes of problems. I'm going to provide examples for each today. Okay, so the first problem is compressed sensing. So the problem here is this. Let's say we are given a low resolution blood flow data, and we would like to reconstruct the high resolution blood flow data. Okay, so this might seem a little bit magical at first, but if you take your low resolution data Y, and then you have your high resolution data X, which you want to get, And the only constraint here really that you have is that at the location, at the low-res locations, your data needs to conform with the measurements. And that's through the measurement matrix C that specifies those measurement locations. Now, this obviously has infinite solutions. But we can actually enable a unique solution by if we find a sparsifying basis or transform phi that can sparsify our high resolution data. So if we have that transformation phi that can sparsify our data and we can get sparse data S, then we can find a solution to this seemingly problem without a unique solution. So this is how it's done. We write the compressed sensing problem. So really all we're doing here is that we're minimizing the L1 norm of S, and the constraint here is that we want to obey our low resolution experimental measurements. Okay, and the L1 norm here is used to promote sparsity because we're assuming that our transformation phi is sparsifying our data. So this is a classical compressed sensing problem, and if we know how to sparsify our data, and if we design that measurement matrix C appropriately, then we can use this method to increase the resolution of our data. So now the question here that you might ask is that, well, how do we select this transform phi to sparsify our data? So there are three main approaches that we can answer this. The first is that, okay, we can go ahead and use standard sparsifying bases, for example, wavelets or discrete cosine transforms, among other bases. Or we can use the machine learning reduced order models. So basically we use PCA modes and we train with training data to basically use a machine learning approach to learn the sparsifying basis. And finally, we can directly learn sparsifying basis from our data using dictionary or transform learning. So in this talk today, I'm going to talk about the first two approaches. Okay, so here's an example for compressed sensing. Let's say we have low resolution blood flow waveform data. This is for an aortic aneurysm, and we would like to reconstruct a high resolution waveform. So this is practically used in assigning boundary conditions when we do these types of patient-specific CFD simulations. So on the top here, you're looking at the downsampled signal. So this is flow rate over time for several cardiac cycles. So let's say we have low resolution flow rate data. And if we apply our compressed sensing algorithm to this low resolution data using a discrete cosine transform as our sparsifying basis, we can get this data at the second row. And if you compare to the ground truth data here that we have, we basically create the downsample data from the ground truth actually in this example, we can see that the compressed sensing algorithm does a fairly good job of recovering the ground truth data and recovering the patterns in the data for the high resolution signal. Okay, so the second class of problems I'm going to talk about today are machine learning reduced order models. And the problem here is slightly different. So let's say we have a low resolution experimental blood flow data, and we also have noise in our experimental data. And on the other side, we also have CFD models, high resolution CFD models. But the problem with our CFD models is that it's suffering from uncertainty in parameters, okay? Can we use all of these tools that we have to to produce higher fidelity data? So the way we do that is that we can take our CFD model, run it multiple times by varying our uncertain parameter, let's say beta, okay? So we can vary our uncertain parameter within a range where we think the uncertain parameter lies, and we create multiple CFD simulations. Then we take the data from each set of CFD simulations. We find the POD or PCA modes from those data. So these are the phis that you see here. And then we stack these PCA modes together to create a big matrix psi, okay? So you can think of this matrix psi as a reduced order surrogate for all possible behaviors that your system could have. But you don't know exactly where your system is. You just have a reduced order approximation of all the possibilities that you think your system could have. Now, what you do after you build this library of CFD modes, then you have your low resolution experimental data. If you look at the figure, that's Y hat. And all you do now is that you apply the compressed sensing problem that we saw before, okay? So we apply the compressed sensing problem. We require our data, our solution to match the low resolution experimental data at the locations where we do have experimental data. And we also use the L1 norm to promote sparsity. And from this framework, we can identify our uncertain parameter, and we can also reconstruct our high resolution data. Now, one thing that we can also do is that if you take the constraint, we can also relax the constraint using a parameter epsilon. So we don't exactly require our solution to match the low resolution experimental data. This performs better under noisy data. And also what our data showed was that if you do this relaxation, it can do a much better job in parameter identification, especially if you don't have a very good experimental resolution. You can use this relaxation to do a much better job of identifying your uncertain parameter. Okay, now let's look at an example. So the example here is a blood flow in an aneurysm. We have a 2D aneurysm in this example. It's an idealized model. And let's say we don't know the viscosity. So this could be practically a hemorrhagical disorder. For example, we know in diabetes patients, we do have significant variation in viscosity. So what we do in this problem is that we take a range for viscosity, and we don't exactly know where the viscosity is located at. And on the other side, we also have experimental data, which are directly measured from that patient. And that experimental data, we assume we only have 150 spatial locations or 150 sensors. And that data is also noisy. So here in this case, we consider 5% relative Gaussian noise. And what you want to do is that you want to identify the appropriate viscosity to parameter identification and also reconstruct the high resolution data. Okay, and I should mention that the experimental data is collected only at one time step, as you can see in this waveform. Okay, we only have data at one time step, and we don't know exactly where it is. So what we do is that we build our library and we apply the algorithm that I talked about. And if you look at the results, so we consider here a range of viscosity values for our POD modes, and the ground truth here is mu equals 0.2. And you can see that the modes associated with viscosity equals 0.2 are the modes that are actually becoming active. So you can see that the algorithm is correctly identifying the correct ground truth viscosity value. And you can see that only a very few modes are becoming active. And this should not be surprising because we are using an L1 norm, right? It's an L1 regression problem. So we are promoting sparsity, which is actually what we want, right? Because we know that we have a certain viscosity in our ground truth data. Okay, and then so the problem does a pretty good job, and then we can also reconstruct our velocity data, and we can see that also the algorithm does a very good job of reconstructing the ground truth data. So now, one question here you might ask is that, can we select these measurement locations in an optimal fashion? So let's say I don't have 150 sensors or 150 resolution for my experimental data. I have much lower resolutions. Can I pick those resolution measurement locations in an optimal fashion to still get the same performance? It turns out we can do that. And in this case, we used a QR decomposition algorithm to achieve this goal. I'm not going to go over the details here, but I'm just going to show you a simple example. We have a Womersley flow, so the 1D Womersley flow problem for pulsatile blood flow. And let's say we only have 5 measurement locations. And we don't know the Womersley number. We want to reconstruct the velocity profile with only 5 spatial measurement locations. So on the right panels, we place those 5 measurement locations in a random fashion. So it's a random sampling. And you can see that the reconstructed data from the algorithm is not really good, especially under noisy data. It's really, really bad. But if you place those sensor locations in an optimal fashion, what you can see is that you can reconstruct your complete velocity profile much, much more accurately. And it also performs much better under noisy data. Okay, so the final class of problems I want to talk about are matrix completion or low-rank data recovery. So the problem here is different. So let's say we don't know a sparsifying basis, right? So let's say we don't have that sparsifying basis that we used in the previous 2 class of problems. Do we still have hope to reconstruct our data from partial measurements? Okay, so let's consider our data matrix X again. And let's say at random spatial or temporal locations, we're missing data. Okay, so this could be either due to the low resolution that we have in our experimental measurement, or it could be due to, let's say, some of our measurement points, we detect them to be outliers. This could be through robust statistics methods or any other method that we use to identify outliers and discard that data. So then we have these question marks at spatial temporal locations where we do not have data, but we want to recover them, right? So it turns out under certain conditions, we can solve this problem. One of those conditions is that if we know that our data matrix X is low rank. In other words, if we know that we have high correlation in our data, then we can have hope to reconstruct our data. The way we do that is that by solving this optimization problem, we want to minimize the rank of our data matrix X. And the constraint that we have here is that at the location points where we do have data, we want those data to be satisfied. We want our solution to satisfy or respect those measurement locations. Okay, so now minimizing the rank is not an easy optimization problem. So what we do is that we convert it to a convex optimization problem using the nuclear norm, which acts as a surrogate for rank. And then we can use standard linear algebra methods to solve these convex optimization problem. Okay, so here's an example in, again, the same 2D aneurysm model. Let's say we have a low spatial temporal sampling of the data, and we want to reconstruct the full data. So we have 2 points here. Point A is inside the aneurysm sac, and point B is in the parent artery. So in the plots, the red lines, the blue lines are the original data, and the red lines are what we're reconstructing with our algorithm. So if we only have 40% data sampling, by data sampling here, I mean, when I say 40%, I mean in space and time. Okay, so for point B, that's in the parent artery, you can see that the algorithm does a very good job of exactly reconstructing the data. And for the point A, that's inside the aneurysm, you can still see pretty good performance. There are some errors at certain locations, but for most of the time, the algorithm does a good job. And if you push it to the limit of only 10% data sampling, you can see that for point B in the parent artery, still you can get a fairly good agreement. Of course, there's more error now. And for point A, that's inside the aneurysm where we have much more complex blood flow data, you can see that the algorithm now starts to perform poorly with 10% data sampling, but it still can capture the general trends. Okay, now some challenges with these types of methods is that we need to find an appropriate sparsifying basis. And also, for these methods, we really need to investigate the robustness with respect to noise and outliers. Some of these methods are really sensitive to these things. And also, most of these methods that I talked about, they work well when the sample data satisfies the so-called restricted isometric property. In practice, we often achieve this by doing random sampling of our data, but this is something that could certainly receive more attention. So in future work, we would like to do complex 3D patient-specific flows. We like to extend our PCA methods to nonlinear PCA methods. These are also known as generalized PCA, for example, spectral clustering and K-subspace algorithms for more accurate identification of low dimensionality. And we're also interested in using neural networks and autoencoders to achieve this. And finally, practical applications such as 4D flow MRI or PIV data are of interest. So I would like to thank my students. I'd like to thank my funding sources, and also I encourage you to check out our paper and archive if you're interested in this work. You can also find other methods we talk about in our paper, like Cindy, robust PCA, and DMD. And also you can check out my student Milad Habibi's talk in the same session, where he talks about data assimilation using model order reduction and Kalman filter. Thank you.